Okay, good. Thanks a lot. It's great to have the opportunity here to listen, to participate in the Brainstorm sessions. It's very beneficial for us. So my name is Ming Zhang. I'm with the World Bank. I'm manager for one region. We have 6 regions in the bank. I'm manager for one region, Latin America, the Caribbean, working on urban development and disaster risk management. It's really close link to the urban growth. I used to work in South Asia and also East Asia, Pacific. So today, I think what I will just do, give a little bit overview of what we do in the World Bank in the urban development area. And then I just, in the spirit of the brainstorming, I just want to highlight some of the major challenges that we together are grappling with our clients, with the cities and the countries. Not sort of giving answers, but really just highlight some of the sort of hotspots that we are facing in terms of our work. So I've been working in the World Bank for 20 years and always been working on the urban development sort of area. I think one thing you feel the change over the years is the recognition that the role of cities play in the overall development agenda, because the World Bank, our main mission is really on poverty. So we sort of working on poverty across many different disciplines. So we, as a sort of, for cities, for space, we actually need to fight for the space there, because why isn't education more important than city development? Why isn't industrial policy more important? So over the years, I think in the whole sort of development discourse, both from the government side and from the World Bank side, I think you see sort of more recognition of how important the space issue and the city issue is in the whole sort of development agenda. So it's much easier to say, I don't need to justify too much why cities are important. It's more a question of how to do it than why I need to do it. We still have some issue of why, but it's more issue of how. So just some little bit background on the sort of broad things that we see. I think on the development, the economic transformation of reducing agriculture and a growing service, it's really linked to urbanization, where you see actually the urban share. This you see from the red one from India from 1994 to 2013, and Vietnam from 1996 to 2013. The agriculture share is sort of reducing and the urban share is growing, which is sort of follow the trajectory of Korea. And the two things that we sort of focus a lot on World Bank, sort of two mission statement, the reduce extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. So you look at the linkage, it's not necessarily causality, but it's linkage. You could look at the poverty sort of with urbanization is linked to the reduced poverty and to increase the sort of GDP. So I think that linkage between urbanization and economic growth and the poverty reduction has been well recognized. Then the kind of the challenges sort of we work with. I think the economic importance of cities, they produce 80% of global economic activities, but the urban areas is growing, 2.5 billion people, additional residents between now and 2050. which means 1.2 million square kilometers of built-up areas. In South Asia, where I used to work with, the rough estimate is in the next 15 and 20 years, you have the built-up area double in the next 15 and 20 years. I think that's really, really very, very important. And how that built-up area would double, in what form, would have a huge implication in the next 100 years, 200 years. Then accommodate these people, then the living in the slums, the housing issues. So default, in many countries, the default way of urbanization is slum, is people moving to the slums. So how to provide affordable housing. And one thing is, 1.5 billion people exposed to all the natural disasters, cyclones, earthquakes, and that, as I sort of would mention a little bit more, is becoming increasingly sort of more important issue for local and national leaders, that the disasters, natural and human sort of disasters keep happening, and how to deal with that, the resilience issue. And of course, the impact of cities on climate change, on the global sort of environment issue. So that's where I think we highlighted the sort of importance of the whole urban agenda, from economic growth, from resilience, from livability, from the sort of global sort of environment effect. So the key sort of pillar, the work that we do in the World Bank, I think there are different ways to divide it. I would say three pillars. The first is strengthen it's basically the fundamentals right. Strengthen city finance, planning, governance systems, a lot to do with the relationship between central government, local government, strengthening the capacity financial system, governance of the local government system. And then the second area on the improve the living conditions is different types of infrastructure services, land, tenure, security, housing, neighborhood quality. And then the sort of more high level urban transformation in terms of looking at urban planning, integrated investment in infrastructure and service, and the resilience sort of agenda. These are three sort of broader categories. The kind of work we do, basically we have two things. We of course sort of offer financing for infrastructure investment, other kinds of investment. So it's lending, investment operations, financial operations, but also we do quite a lot of non-lending activities, analytical works, and technical assistance. So these are the two major things we work on, and then really divided it. There's one thing on the sort of urban area, working on the topic of cities, urban development. It's so integrated, it's so comprehensive. So if you look at the sort of business line, that kind of work we do, it's very dispersed. So it's like, unlike if you work in transport, people can tell you, what we do in transport. We do roads, we do public transport, we do airlines, and ports and these things. In so the urban city area, it's very diverse and kind of hard to define. So so we divided the sort of business lines into these 6 areas. The first one, city economic growth, really linking the cities to the broad economic territorial development, competitive cities, economic development zones, and all these things. The second area, urban poverty, inclusion. Traditionally, we do slum upgrading, urban poverty, like a community-driven development, targeted urban poverty interventions, and expanding more on the inclusion agenda to different groups, including gender, including indigenous people, etc. The third one, we do a lot of municipal infrastructure service, transport, water, energy, But that also sort of you expanded the service area into the new frontier areas. So, for example, traditionally we don't do much on the public space parks. That's considered not essential for the poor. You shouldn't sort of waste money on these parks. And now there's a more recognition how important this public space for the city residents in general, particularly for the poor who don't have access to this exclusive sort of public space. So the other area in this is, I think, in the frontier area, which there's a lot of demand, but we don't really know how to do very well, is the crime and violence. That's essential services that need to be provided by the municipal government, and this is really sort of the tough issues to deal with. Affordable housing, land, I think we sort of mentioned that. Urban management, finance, governance, that's actually a lot of this, to some extent, the core, the fundamental of sort of our work. And finally, on the urban resilience, climate change agenda, so there's a sort of lot of demand, both on the adaptation, on the mitigation, but actually more and more strong demand on the adaptation, particularly the resilience sort of work. So this, we kind of work all over the developing sort of world. I mentioned the lending investment operation. We do have a quite strong sort of analytical work. I think there are two main things. One is really try to reflect the importance of the city and the spatial development agenda on the whole development discourse on the poverty, why they are linked to the to poverty reduction and how. So this, we had the last few years, 5-10 years, we have this product urbanization review, which has been done for many countries. This is where we really look at the linkage between spatial development, urban growth, and sort of national economic sort of poverty reduction. And so this sort of it's really important to link this urban to the broad national development agenda. And then based on this, we also have some of the more regional and global studies. So we have, I think we finished the work on South Asia, Africa, East Asia. We're working on 5 minutes, okay. Cut me enough time. So I'll talk a little bit about the main challenges that we have working in the urban area. So one of the issues sort of rapid urbanization in countries with low-income countries with weak institutional fiscal capacity. So if you look at the level where you reach 40% income level, you reach 40% of urbanization level. In sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, you have a much sort of lower level of income. So you're dealing with the typical urban problems you need to deal with, but the over income level is very low, and the scale that's needed for the gap, for the deficit, is really huge. So, you know, $800 billion infrastructure deficit for South Asia and etc. I mentioned the disaster, the risk, the vulnerability is increasing, and this whole urban resilience agenda, it's basically cities know natural disasters, other disasters are going to happen to us. What do we do about these things? This access to jobs, you know, so you have a big city like Nairobi, but most people, especially for the poor, their access to jobs is only through walk or this local transport, matatu. And then 60 minutes, how much sort of access you have, you can actually access to only 11% of the jobs. With a similar study in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, that's even lower. So basically, the cities are big, but the jobs you can access is actually very small because of the limited transportation system. The livability issue, you know, you look at some of the orange South Asia cities, you look at urban density is actually quite high, but the livability, which is this axis, is quite low. So this, you know, when you talk about high density sort of development, what does it mean and how does this translate to livability? And again, underlying most of the issues, the municipal finance and the governance system, the accountability issues, how to deal with that. So that's sort of one of the major sort of challenges. The second challenge, I would just say, how to, as I mentioned, the cities are growing a lot, how to accommodate this growth. Not going to explain so this is actually one interesting thing. In the South Asia, we look at this, you know, this growth. This is India, Delhi, and Lahore in Pakistan. If you look at the whole sort of growth in the from 2000 in 10 years, you saw tremendous growth, and the border between India and Pakistan is probably the sort of most strict border between countries. But if you look at just physically, it's just one continuous sort of region. 2 minutes. And more than 70 million people across many different jurisdictional sort of boundary. But also, if we look at it, sort of the communication linkages, there's no linkage between these two places. You look at, so this is typical, sort of more extreme version of the spatial agglomeration that you see in different, so rapid urban expansion, which cuts on jurisdictional boundary, how to manage these things. So how to manage sort of urban expansion. Theoretically, everybody knows we should plan ahead for this urban growth to happen. But in fact, in de facto, really very few countries, cities, have the capacity to do it. They know they should do it, but it's in reality on the ground, it's not happening. In these metropolitan areas, how to manage this agglomeration of the cities. Housing, as I mentioned, it's a really big shortage. This is the value of accumulated housing shortage among the major countries. Now, we actually have, over the years, have worked a lot on housing and a lot on this right side, which is demand side, subsidy, mortgage, and those things. But I think the bigger constraint quite often, and we still need to do a lot, is on the supply side. Why not more housing is being built, provided? Is it land issues, government interventions, is the tenure ownership structure? And that really need public and private to work together. And that's also, you know, housing, land development is an area where a lot of under-the-table deals, things could happen. So it's really difficult, but it's a sort of challenge area. I'm taking 2 more minutes, I'll be finishing. So this is the kind of, in terms of urban expansion, that just shows some of the projects. This is like in Buenos Aires, we're working on the upgrading of existing area, right in the center of the cities, where you have a sort of old slum. It's basically increasing housing in the center of the city. And in the periphery urban expansion, we don't do much on the expansion in the new area. This is one example in India. They're building Amaravati, a new capital city, which is the new capital of Andhra Pradesh. They split the state, so they need a new capital. So this is kind of the new sort of urban development that we're doing. So that's the challenge of 3. I actually don't need to spend too much. Territorial regional development. It's very similar to, strangely, very similar to what Alex Glaser sort of presented for the US sort of cases. I think the question is, you have, for most of the countries, you have concentration, agglomeration, growth in the big cities. What to do with the lagging sort of regions? I think for most government, it's very hard to say politically. We just let these regions, sort of let people move out or let these regions die. So, and you can see sort of also in the developing countries, the disparity in the regional difference is also much more stark. And I think there's economic reasons, but also historically there are sort of political reasons. I think policy-wise, historically, quite often, many countries are sort of their policies being place-centered. They favor a lot on the big cities, on the capital cities, and politically ignore or the lagging regions, and actually a lot of it is related to disempowerment of the lagging regions. So there's a sort of economic, but also there's a sort of political reasons on the lagging region development. So that's sort of another challenge. There's a strong demand across different places. So I'll just stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Good. Let's take a couple of questions. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Fran Tonkis from the London School of Economics. And I wanted to ask you to reflect on something which was, for me at least, as someone who works in this area, implicit throughout your presentation, and you hinted at it a couple of times. You began with this persistent and widespread correlation between higher rates of urbanization and lower rates of poverty. And I wanted to ask you to reflect, given you've had 2 decades experience in these very key regions for current urbanization processes, on what your experience is of these sorts of interventions that are more egalitarian, more inclusive, because of course what we're seeing are decreasing rates of poverty, increasing rates of urbanization, but increasing rates of inequality. And I know the World Bank is very focused on poverty rather than decreasing inequality, but perhaps more impressionistically, working across East Asia, South Asia, and now Latin America and the Caribbean, the most urbanized part of the world with the highest rates of inequality. Your experience would suggest what is more effective in supporting urban transformation without deepening urban inequalities?
Okay, that's
maybe some good practice that you've observed.
No, I think this really sort of critical issue. So one is you need to sort of look at the whole sort of spectrum, because to some extent, in a lot of the countries, urban poverty is to some of the ideally, if it happens, is the transition between rural poverty and the sort of urban middle income. So you kind of, people move to the city in a very dire environment, very, bad living conditions, a lot of uncertainties, because there's this opportunities sort of in the city. So one sort of you need to look at that spectrum. I think the other thing, the housing is a really critical issue. I think we haven't, a lot of cities haven't really looked at it, because I think it was mentioned before, the access to jobs is critical. And access to jobs is really, the jobs quite often located in area where the house prices is high. And the transportation cost for a lot of the low-income folks is very low. So I think how to get this affordable housing in good locations where people need to access to, I think that's something really sort of important we haven't to sort of look at. And that's critical. And it's not affordable housing. It's not necessarily nice, low-cost housing. it can be slums, but really how to, this is sort of not, to some extent, slums is sort of natural sort of affordable housing. So how to improve from that side? That's sort of the other thing. I think the one last sort of point to look at is this whole urban poverty issue. It's complicated because you have the transition issue, but also the vulnerability of the urban poverty is very high. Because you can, if you look at the measure at pure income level, they are actually much higher than the sort of rural folks. But they're very vulnerable. So this whole multifaceted measurement of urban poverty and provide sort of support to this group, I think that's sort of another.
Hi. I have a question. I was very impressed with all the bank is doing. So my question is not a critique, it's just why are you perhaps also doing this? And so I have been involved with a whole bunch of people who use digital instruments, but also biological. In other words, the famous whatever elements that you can paint. Well, let me not develop. My question is the World Bank also experimenting with these new modalities so you can mobilize a whole neighborhood around upgradings of a certain kind that have a knowledge function, so you need a bit of assistance, so the World Bank would be well placed, and that deal with environmental questions, especially environmental, I guess, but de facto also wind up with inequality issues. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I'm talking about? In other words, it comes from the biological sciences, from the digital tech, yeah. There are enormous ranges of interesting applications that can mobilize a neighborhood with just a bit of funding and just a bit of expert advice. Yeah,
the sort of interesting about working in the World Bank, so we're big corporate and things, but you do have, if you work anybody with the World Bank, you work with some task team leaders, individual TTLs, where they can be very entrepreneurial. So this is, I think, most of our new stuff came from. And I think on that area, we have some guy who's very techie savvy, working in Africa, I think at Tanzania, some other countries, on the using of technologies. They do community mapping, they do look at that sort of assets. I mean, that's one of the, yeah.
Okay, very good. Okay. So let's thank Ming Zhang.
Ming Zhang, thank you.